Let's be honest, suffering feels terrible. Whether it's a deep loss, a chronic illness, a crushing failure, or relentless anxiety, pain in our lives often feels like a cruel, senseless intruder. It disrupts our plans, steals our joy, and leaves us feeling vulnerable and exposed. And in those moments, many of us instinctively retreat inward, trying to shore up our defenses, protect ourself, our ego from the onslaught. We might think, this is happening to me, feeling singled out or unfairly targeted. We double down on our sense of self, our independence, our perceived strength, hoping to weather the storm. But what if, in those very moments, the pain wasn't just an attack on you, but was actually doing something to your deepest sense of self? What if suffering's most profound work wasn't just on your external circumstances, but on the very ego you were trying so desperately to protect? The brilliant writer G.K. Chesterton had a fascinating paradoxical view on this, suggesting that suffering isn't just an unwelcome guest, it's often the necessary force for something radical and transformative, the death of the ego. And understanding why he thought this might change how you make sense of your own struggles. G.K. Chesterton was a master at seeing the profound truths hidden in plain sight, often using paradox to shock us into recognition. He saw the world as sacramental, full of signs pointing to deeper realities, and he looked at suffering, that most universal and unwelcome human experience, not just as a problem to be solved or a mystery to be endured, but as an active, powerful force with a specific effect on the human person, particularly on what we might call the ego. Now, what did Chesterton mean by ego in this context? He wasn't a psychoanalyst, but he understood the human tendency to construct a strong, central self, an identity built on our achievements, our intellect, our control over our environment, our sense of independence, our feeling that we are the masters of our own fate, separate and self-sufficient. This ego is the part of us that likes to be in charge, that prefers certainty, that takes credit for successes, and that feels threatened by vulnerability and dependence. It's the me that stands apart, often feeling its own importance and capability above all else. Suffering, in Chesterton's view, is uniquely designed to target this ego. Why? Because suffering, by its very nature, is something we cannot control. We cannot reason it away with our intellect, as intellectual ego might try. We cannot push it away with sheer willpower, as the ego of strength might attempt. We cannot escape it by rearranging our external circumstances, as the ego of control desires. Suffering is an external force that invades our carefully constructed internal world and simply happens to us, regardless of our will or capability. This is where suffering becomes the great dissolvent of the ego. The things the ego relies on, control, predictability, personal strength, self-sufficiency, are precisely what suffering takes away or renders useless. When you are in deep pain, whether physical or emotional, your ability to control your environment diminishes. Your plans are interrupted, your physical or emotional strength wanes, your self-sufficiency feels like a cruel joke. You are forced into a state of uncontrolledness, of weakness, of dependence. And for the ego, this is a form of death. The ego thrives on being in charge, on being separate and capable. Suffering forces the ego to confront its own fundamental powerlessness and interdependence. It shatters the illusion of total control. It breaks down the walls of self-sufficiency. It reveals the uncomfortable truth that we are vulnerable, limited, and inherently connected to others and dependent on realities outside of ourselves, ultimately dependent on God. This death of the ego through suffering isn't annihilation in a negative sense, it's a death that leads to a different kind of life. It's the breaking of a hard shell so that something more real, more open, can emerge. The ego keeps us small, contained within our own perspective and perceived capabilities. Suffering, by dismantling the ego's fortress, can open us up to a larger world, the world of shared human vulnerability, the world of unconditional love received when we can give nothing in return, the world of grace that is utterly undeserved, the world of a God who is present not just in strength, but in weakness. Chesterton saw this as a paradox fittingly. The thing that feels like it's destroying you, the suffering, is actually destroying the part of you, the ego, that might have been preventing you from truly living, from truly connecting, from truly receiving the grace and love that exist outside your self-made walls. It's a painful process, like surgery without anesthetic, but Chesterton argued that for the soul wrapped too tightly in its own ego, it is a necessary, even saving intervention. Suffering doesn't just cause pain, it performs a radical surgery on the ego, clearing the way for a more humble, open, and ultimately fuller experience of reality and relationship. Now let's bring this Chestertonian perspective into the messy, painful reality of your own life. Have you ever been through a period of intense suffering? Perhaps an illness, a job loss that stripped away your professional identity, a broken relationship that shattered your sense of self-worth, or a personal failure that humiliated you? Think about how that felt. Beyond the immediate pain, didn't it also feel like your usual ways of coping, your usual sense of who you were and what you could handle, were somehow ineffective, undermined? That feeling, according to Chesterton's view, was the pain doing its work on your ego. The part of you that wanted to be strong, capable, and in control was confronted with its opposite: weakness, incapability, and a complete lack of control. And in that confrontation, the ego began to crumble. Maybe, because of that suffering, you had to ask for help for the first time in years. Maybe you had to admit you didn't have all the answers, that you couldn't fix everything yourself. Maybe you experienced the profound humility of being cared for when you were unable to care for yourself. Maybe the loss of something you identified with heavily, like a job or a role, forced you to discover who you were without that external validation.
These are all signs of the ego suffering its necessary death. It's not a comfortable process. It's messy, disorienting, and painful. No one wants to feel weak, dependent, or out of control. But Chesterton suggests that accepting this forced humility, this dismantling of the ego, is precisely what opens us up. What fruit can come from this? When the ego dies down, the proud, self-sufficient shell breaks, making space for authentic connection. You can connect with others not from a position of strength or curated image, but from shared vulnerability. You see their struggles more clearly, and they can see your real self. Genuine humility, not as self-deprecation, but as a clear-eyed view of your place in the world, interconnected, limited, and dependent on grace. Receptivity to grace. When you are no longer relying solely on your own efforts or believing you've earned everything, you become open to receiving undeserved gifts. Love, forgiveness, spiritual comfort, things the ego often resists because they challenge its self-made narrative. Deeper faith. Suffering can strip away a superficial faith based on comfort or control, leaving a deeper trust in a God who is present even in brokenness and whose power is often made perfect in weakness, as Scripture also suggests.
Chesterton's perspective doesn't glorify suffering, but it does suggest it has a potential, if painful, purpose in our spiritual formation. It's the fire that refines, burning away the dross of the ego to reveal the more authentic, humble, and receptive person underneath. It's a difficult truth to accept, especially when you are in the midst of pain, but it offers a profound hope that your suffering might not be meaningless, but might be the very process through which your truest self is being saved, not from pain itself, but from the isolation and limitation of the ego. Chesterton's idea of suffering leading to the death of the ego is a challenging one, pushing back against our natural inclination to protect ourselves at all costs. It asks us to consider that sometimes the very thing we are fighting against is doing a necessary, if painful, work for us.
How does this idea resonate with your own experience? Have you ever looked back at a time of significant suffering and seen how it changed your sense of self, making you less reliant on your own strength or more open to vulnerability and connection? Did it feel like a painful dismantling of an old self, paving the way for something new? The concept of ego death can sound intense, but perhaps Chesterton simply meant becoming less self-centered and more open-centered, less reliant on self and more reliant on grace. What do you think? Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. Let's explore this complex and powerful idea together. If this discussion of Chesterton and the transformative power of suffering has been meaningful to you, please give this video a like. Sharing it can also help others who are grappling with pain and searching for meaning. And of course, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our future explorations of faith, life, and insightful thinkers. Thank you for watching and for joining this important conversation. May you find grace and hope even in the midst of your struggles.